Hi students, today I am going to teach you Robert Browning, and I am taking a very important aspect of Robert Browning as a poet, that is, we will discuss him as a romantic poet. You might not have studied Browning through this angle. See, first very important thing is that Robert Browning was a poet who came under a great influence of Byron, who came under the great influence of a great poet like P.B. Shelley and even Keats when he was a youth, means when he was of young age. And his acquaintances, his knowing of these great personalities with these poets was actually like a great literary experience which confirmed him in the choice while he was making his career as a poet. He was so much influenced that it was his wish, it was his, that inclination which made him confirm in his mind, in his subconscious, that yes, he want to make him a career in poetry, in poet, as becoming a poet. And for some time, Shelley and Keats had a strong hold on his imagination. And when Robert Browning wrote Pauline at the age of only 20 years, he was still under the dominion of Shelley. Still under the dominion of Shelley, whom he had idolized in the poem under the name of the Sun Trader. Sun Trader. He had idolized Shelley in the name of Sun Trader. Much of the imagery of the poem Pauline, we can say, is Shelleyan. Shelley se bana hai term Shelleyan. Means he was so much influenced by Shelley that the imageries which he has taken, which he has written, can be said as Shelleyan. And in the poem, we can discover roughly the nucleus समझते हैं, बायोलॉजी का टर्म है, nucleus of Browning's theory of life. His interest in the mystery, his interest in the development of the human soul, and his faith in religion and his faith in God. So, all this shows that none of the influences of the romantic poets, not even Shelley's, had any lasting effect upon his poetry, much less upon his later poetry. Actually, one thing is to be told here, students, that Browning was too original a thinker to follow in the wake of the youthful models for a long period of time. And he had a great intellect, he had a great mind. So his over plus of intellect in the poetical composition, his dramatic instinct, his analytical tendencies, his sense of form, his outlines, which made him actually a great intellectual realist in the age which was dominated by Romanticism. There was a professor known as Professor Herford, Herford. He has pointed to the various divergent tendencies in the Browning's romantic temperament and his realistic senses, shifting complexion of finite and the infinite. According to Professor Herford, all poetry is the problem of putting the infinite into the finite. Both sides of the antithesis represented the instincts in the mental nature, drawing a lot of nourishment from the springs of feeling and the thought. So we can say that the province, the area of his passion for infinity was the eager, was the restlessness, was the self-consciousness to become all natures, yet retaining the law of his own being. Browning has his, his full portion of the romantic idealism, which under the twofold stimulus of literary and political revolution has animated the poetry of the previous generation. But we can say he clearly shared the uplifted spirit of Shelley. Shelley abhors limits. Everything grows ethereal before his imagination. The infinity he aspires after unveiling itself, which is impalpable and undefined. Browning's restlessly aspiring temperament worked under the control of an ear and eye that has fastened with the eagerness, and the ultimate psychological result was that the brilliant clarity and the brilliant precision of his imagined forms gathered a lot of richness, gathered a lot of intensity. And for Browning, the finite did not remain the rival or the antithesis, but became the language of the infinite. So we can say that Browning, while a romantic in temper, was in comparison with his predecessors a thoroughist, a realist in method. And all the romantic poets of the previous generation has refused and decried some large portion of reality. If we take the name of Wordsworth, Wordsworth had averted his ken from half of human fate. Keats and Shelley turned from the formlessness of human society. So all these three great poets were out of sympathy with civilization. But Browning found his poetry preeminently among the pursuits, the passions, the interests, and the problems of civilized men. He is the poet par excellence of the glory of failure and dissatisfaction. But his life was, in the main, that of one who has succeeded and who was satisfied with the success. He lived in the world and loved the earth's way. He lacked the stranger and subtler sensibilities of ear and eye, to which the nature poetry of the 19th century owes so much. He could not, like Wordsworth, hear the sound of alien melancholy given out from the mountains before a storm, like Wordsworth used to do. So, Browning's poetry, you can say, leading him to dramatize the conflicts and the antagonisms of human life, was the necessity of finding in him or in them the evidence of the presence of absolute good. Fine. One thing would I like to say, that Browning was a lover of beauty in nature, but he was not a nature mystic like some of the romantics, nor had he any philosophy of nature. He had no theory about the relation between man and nature like that of Wordsworth. And to both Shelley and Wordsworth, nature was a refuge for the broken spirits, but not so in Browning. According to Browning, there is hardly any community of spirit between the two. They are two separate temporarily. And in this, Browning is distinctly apart from Tennyson, who, like Coleridge, speaks sometimes of a harmony between nature and the two souls. So, this is actually to understand about Browning that Browning rarely exults in nature for her own sake, as the Romantics do. He loved man more than he did nature, and he uses nature as a background for human life. Browning is capable of describing scenes of nature very vividly, very accurately, and very often comes near rivaling, Alfred Tennyson. But he never humanizes. He never sentimentalizes nature. Unlike landscapes imagined by Shelley and imagined by other romantic poets, Browning की जो landscape होती है, they are always very real. They belong to some actual scene. So we find that Browning's attitude towards nature is not the same as that too of the Romantics, though at times he has revealed an acute sensitiveness towards beauty which is in no way inferior to that of Keats or Tennyson or Byron or Coleridge. Apart from this, Browning also had a romantic interest in the past. He very often took his subjects and themes from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, from the Greece, from the Rome, from the France, from Russia. But here again I would like to say that he stood apart from the Romantics. He was interested in these ages because they provided him with a variety of people representing some interesting phase of the mind which was a subject of his study. So that is why he was interested. And though Browning emphasizes a world beyond the visible world where man could find the consummation of his ruined hopes and aspirations, he was too much of a realist to become a pure mystic. Understood, students? So this will make you understand that what actually Browning was and how he was a great romantic. He has the romantic temper, but what happened? His method was that of a realist. And in spite of the fact that Romanticism was quite dominant in that age in which Browning lived, yet he was too original, too dramatic, too analytical, and too intellectual to become a romantic altogether. So finally, again the same sentence, he has a romantic temper, but his method is that of a realist. So this covers your great, the topic, Robert Browning as a romantic poet. So in connection with Browning as a poet, we have just studied Browning as a romantic poet, but the next topic, which is even more important, for which Browning is known, is Robert Browning as a writer of dramatic monologues. Perhaps, students, the most marked characteristic of poetry of Browning, except the earliest tentative attempts made under the influence, as we have discussed, Shelley, Keats, Byron, it is his dramatic quality. His genius expresses itself in the forms of real life, in the supposed experiences of men and even, yes, women. So these men and women are usually in a state of mental disturbance. They are in a state of conflict. They think much more than they actually act. So his poetry is dramatic in principle. So many utterances of so many persons. And Browning says in the preface to Pauline, no true poet, according to him, should reveal his own personality in his poetry. His art was to depict the character by making speak the very man as he was wont to do, which he has already said in his poem Sordello. And the poet remains just a spectator. And just a interpreter. interpreter. He does not make people his mouthpieces because they exist in their own right. But we have to admit that Browning occasionally discloses himself in his works. And it is possible to an extent to construct his personality from his own works. But yes, it is also true that we must not lay an undue emphasis on this fact. For we can say that Shakespeare was a perfect dramatist. Browning is undoubtedly a lesser one. He will allow the people to peep through his window if they so prefer, but he will decline to admit their vulgar gaze into the secret chambers of his soul. And insofar as complete isolation from the characters is the test of a good dramatist, Browning is not a good dramatist as Shakespeare, because he does sometimes show active sympathy with the men, with the women he is portraying. But yes, there are a number of other characters with whom he seems to have affinity, and yet he is delineating them with a lot of vividness, with a lot of lucidity, and himself is standing apart all the time. Everything which as a poet he thinks or feels comes from him in a dramatic, a complete living form. And besides the dramatic treatment, Browning has also the unique capacity of facing the situations which are dramatic in themselves. But as an artist, he is not concerned with the actions of his characters, nor with what they do in these poems, but with what they actually think, with the flux of conflicting ideas, emotions that goes on in their minds and minds. Such poems as thus reflect the souls of different characters, which have been called studies in practical psychology. उसी को कहते हैं dramatic monologues. And the chief concern of such dramatic poetry was the representation of the incidents in the development of the soul, and the dramatic monologue, जिसको कहते हैं dramatic speech, appeared to the poet as something which is known to be an ideal form in which the soul of a man and the inner feelings of his heart could be represented. And Browning's end was the revelation of a character, of thoughts, of passions, and the poet thought that these things could best be presented directly in the dramatic poem by catching and by representing the character in a sort of a confessional monologue. A speech uttered by one person is called monologue, indulged at some high critical moment of life. So this is how you have to understand what is this Browning's dramatic monologue. And Browning chose the monologue for मतलब उसने dramatic monologue ये choose क्यों किया? For many things. For subjective, partly partly objective, partly psychological. Partly psychological and even ethical. Subjective reasons, partly objective reasons, partly psychological reasons or ethical reasons. So these may be the reasons of his connecting towards the Browning's monologue. Now, this is the method of portraiture of characters, and there are many variations of them in the situations, in the form, in the character. If you see, which ranges from the Porphyria's Lover, which was his first monologue, to such masterpieces as Andrea del Sarto, My Last Duchess, A Grammarian's Funeral, The Last Ride Together, Apt Wogler, Mr. Sludge, and the gigantic monologues of The Ring and the Book. So these have been the great monologues books which I have taken the names. If you remember, in one, it is that faultless painter talking to his own wife. Is another, it is in the homicidal duke standing before the picture of, his last duchess, talking to the envoy of a count whose daughter is about to wed. So these have been the great examples of monologues which has been written by Browning. And the earliest glimpses of the dramatic monologue are to be found in Pauline, which I have already told you. And the real beginning of this form was made in the dramatic lyrics. And the monologues show Browning's knowledge of human nature, especially its dark recesses and pitfalls. He was not interested in simple characters. The more the character is tangled, the more passionate, the stormy the experience is, the greater was the zest with which Browning approached them. And he was very much interested in the complexities of the motive and the unexpectedness of the human behavior. So, if you study Robert Browning in totality, you will find that yes, he was a great writer, and a great writer in so many forms. His obscurity, his monologues, his romantic person, his religious concept, his comparison with Tennyson, he as a writer of the Victorian age, and so many things come out when we study dramatic monologues written by Browning. So I hope this whole lecture will find you best to get so much about Robert Browning. Thank you.